Good morning, everyone, once again. We've just heard a lot about collections, about the kind of, in one sense, the end product of what all of us are here for in terms of field work. We're going to go back to the field now. That is, we're not going to dwell particularly on collections. They may come up in the course of our discussion. But this particular panel is all about the idea of inclusion. So when I got the assignment to be in charge of it, I kind of looked and said, well, duh, that's easy. You know, inclusion, we all know about that. Well, think about it a little more and you'll find out that this is actually a much trickier concept than we like to think about. And so what I'd like to do is, this is an old undergraduate trick, you know, when you've got students and they don't know quite where to start their paper, what do? They go to the dictionary and look for the definition of the word that they want you to actually think about. So here's the definition from the Oxford, close to the OED. Maybe I should have used the American Heritage Dictionary because after all, we're here in the heartland of the American Revolution, but as it is, the term inclusion is the action or state of being included or being included with a group or structure. Well, okay, not very helpful, is it? And I'm not really helpful at all. There's a second definition that goes like this: the practice or policy of providing equal access and resources to people whom otherwise might be excluded or marginalized, such as those who have physical or intellectual disabilities or members of other minority groups. That's a little better, but it's also slightly different than the previous definition. But what's going to be interesting about the papers that you hear in a few moments, we have both perspectives being represented in this panel. That is, we're going to be looking at the idea of inclusion, thinking about what groups are, and we're also going to be thinking, though, about the way in which we can enhance inclusion in a variety of different ways. And so I'll let our participants define what these things are, at least in their terms. But for me, I was really excited then to see the funny thing about the definition. It actually works in this case because it's really outlining and highlighting what's going to be talked about later in this session. But I'd like to talk a little bit about the idea of inclusion just for a moment, because as I said earlier, it struck me as one of these concepts that seemed to be relatively simple and straightforward, but when you really begin to dig more deeply into it, it really isn't. And so let me give you a few examples of what I mean by that, and then talk about ways in which we might begin to think about inclusion in a more, I don't know, I wouldn't say creative way necessarily, but a deeper way to consider how we begin to implement inclusion in the work that we do. We use the term community a lot in these discussions. We've heard it almost everybody at some point in their presentation or their question use the word community. But if any of you have actually done field work, you know that communities are really complex places. They're not just simply, oh, we're going to go to community X and we're going to include these people in our conversation, because these people, as you well know, have different ideas and different concepts and different ways of thinking about the world that might not be compatible with you or even compatible with their neighbors. And so the question about inclusion then as a field worker becomes one of these very difficult questions to overcome, is that, well, who is included in my research? Who am I talking to? Are there people that don't want to talk to me? We heard that yesterday from the cowboy ethnographer debunker about the way in which we should not be thinking about necessarily everyone wants to talk. And so inclusion then is this tricky, slippery slope of the way in which we want to think about how we will approach people, how will we begin to work with people, which ones we need to talk to, which ones will be the best interlocutors for the research that we're trying to do. So it's a challenging concept, and I think it's a much harder way to think about the way in which we work than you might expect. You know, some projects, it's all set up for you. You know, you go into the field, your advisor dumps you into a field setting, and there you go. You can go do your work because they've set your community up. But some of us haven't had that luxury, or do it slightly differently, where we have to go out and find our own communities in one sense. That is, we find our research areas, and then we go work in them, and then we begin to think about the whole question of inclusion, community, how community is defined, and then, of course, thinking about how we do, in fact, then provide the benefits of our research back to that community. And so I'll be honest with you, I've had ups and downs in terms of my own background and my own research problems in terms of defining the wrong community sometimes and finding people that just didn't want to get along for different reasons that I was trying to be aware of but couldn't overcome in ways. And so these are things that I think you need to think deeply about before you actually begin your field work, even though you might have a good idea of where you're going and who you're going to be working with. Thinking about inclusion in this way really becomes much more interesting and important. The reason I emphasize this so much is because what inclusion really does, and if you do it properly, and we've heard this from panelists earlier today as well as others during this conversation, is that doing inclusion properly, that is doing it right in terms of the way in which you have engaged with the community, it builds trust. And without trust, your success in the field is going to be limited. You will not do well. It doesn't matter how well you think your research comes out. Scott Edwards last night, a phrase he used in one of his talks, he said, "I hope I've left the community in a better place because I was here than before I came." And that's something that I think many of us have forgotten about or didn't even think about. Did we leave that community in a better place? And that's because we've learned about you need to think about trust and the way in which trust then is engendered, how that's created. As you, the exterior person, you are, in one sense, you are the other in that particular category. They aren't the other. You're the other in this sense. And so your way of dealing with this has to be far more sensitive in terms of thinking about how I'm going to build up that trust than not. Another way I'd like to think about this idea of inclusion is that we can talk about community of and community in. So you're the field worker, you're going to this place, wherever it happens to be, whether it's in Montana or Malawi or wherever. And you're never going to be community in. You will never be part of that community. But, I'm sorry, you'll never be part of that, you'll never be of that community because you do not have that, you're not them in that sense. But you can be in it, and you can be in it by understanding the way in which people make their decisions, the way in which they think about things, the way in which they approach the world. And so how do I do this? How do I build this inclusion? How do I build this trust? How does this work exactly? Well, I'm going to introduce a term that I haven't heard yet at this conference, and it's maybe that's good because I can say it and everyone will go, oh yeah, he's the guy that said that, whether or not it was a good term or not. But have you ever heard the term ethnographic sensibility? No. Well, then this is an education for you that you actually need to, oh, there is one hand waving in the background. Oh, a second hand, all right. I know a few others know the term as well. What is it? Well, this is a term that basically describes how you should think about interacting with people who are not, you're not community of. Your community, you're learning about how this community works. And so ethnographic sensibility, obviously it has something to do with ethnography. I am not asking you to be ethnographers. I'm not asking you to be cultural anthropologists, but I am asking you to think about the way in which you have an open mind and the way in which you deal with people from other disciplines, other cultures, and the way in which you interact with those people. You listen. You don't judge before you listen. You don't even judge necessarily after you've listened. This all sounds like simple things that your mom probably taught you at some point in her life, and maybe you've forgotten. But it's something that you need to think about in terms of you are the other in this place, and you need to conduct yourself with a level of sensitivity about that culture that may make you uncomfortable at some level. But yet that's an essential part of the way in which we build inclusion and ultimately trust and then success of your enterprise. So let me give you a really simple example of ethnographic sensibility, and this is just all made up just by me today, thinking about how I'm going to address this question to this audience. Someone walks up to me outside here in Philadelphia or somewhere else and goes, "Hey, how come you wear your hair like that?" Okay, old guy, gray hair, hasn't cut it for 35 years plus and all that. The proper way to ask me why I wear my hair like that would be something to say, do men of your age do they often wear their hair long? Now that's ethnographic sensibility. In other words, the person wants to know why you in particular are wearing long hair, but coming out it And just asking bluntly is not the right way to go about doing this. And so sensitivity then really requires you to think twice about the way in which you begin to ask your questions, to listen to the answers, respond in an effective manner. So, do your homework in terms of understanding the people that you're working with, whether it be looking at old anthropology, whether looking at reports, looking at other documentary materials that are out there for you to work with and to study. So be sensitive to your cultures. So I'd like to end my conversation here about inclusion with, and then we'll turn to our papers with this following phrase, is that, I've been doing field work as an archaeologist for a very long time, more than 50 years, and I've worked all over the world. And the way I like to think about doing field work is I do comparative research. So I work with the high altitude adaptations, both cultural and biological adaptations. And so what I'm concerned with is that, all right, I go to places that are high on the planet. I've worked in Ethiopia, I've worked in the Andean Altiplano, I've worked in Tibet, and I've worked in the Himalayas. And my goal is then to kind of compare and contrast what I'm learning about those places in terms of how lowlanders became highlanders, which is, one of those interesting cultural, historical, as well as biologically interesting questions that have all sorts of implications for the medical field as well. High elevation is hypoxia. When you have heart problems, you get hypoxia. There's a whole range of things one can learn about understanding this history. So this is not about me, though. What I'm trying to get across now is the following, is that because I have done comparative research across so many different cultures, on the one hand, I've become very sensitive to the idea of ethnographic sensibility. Frankly, I wish I had become attuned to it much earlier in my career, because it's difficult to build bridges. It's difficult to build that trust. And so when you bounce from place to place to place, it can be very challenging and daunting to make sure that you maintain some level of that ethnographic sensibility to create that possibility of trust. So that's why I said earlier in my conversation with you that some of my projects, a few of them, really were not successful in terms of the community relationships. I may have left the communities worse off than when I got there because of my inability to read the map properly. And so I challenge you then, when you begin to think about your own work, is find ways to read that map about the way in which that culture is operating in terms of the interlocutors that you're actually working with, so you give yourself the best chance of success in getting your field work done and leaving the community better off than when you got there. So with that background in mind then, let me talk to you then about the first paper that we're going to have, if I can get this going again. Our first paper is going to be by Katherine Culbertson. She likes to go by Kat, I think, is the way she described herself to me. She's a graduate student, a PhD candidate in the UC Berkeley, one of our Berkeley Mafia here. I'm not Berkeley Mafia. We're three UC people here at one time. I'm sorry. Paul. I'm from UC Berkeley. He's, we got it covered except for one. So in any case, Kat is a PhD candidate in the Department of Program of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management. She works on solutions for rainforest restoration in Madagascar, where she works in collaboration with the Lemur Conservation Foundation and local community members. Her paper is entitled Integrating Ecology with Traditional Botanical Knowledge to Empower Effective Conservation and a Deeper Knowledge of Tropical Ecosystems. With that, Kat, please come up and let us know what you think.
Hello. Thank you for the kind introduction and warm welcome. I'm excited to be a part of this conference today and share a little bit about my collaborators, anecdotes, and a framework for how we think about doing more inclusive, empowering research. So I wrote this paper with several of my collaborators who are based in Madagascar, where I do field work, as well as my co-advisor. And the presentation will follow the same basic structure of the paper. First, going into a little bit of an introduction to the interdependence of biodiversity and traditional ecological knowledge, introducing our case study context in Madagascar, and talking a bit more about the path forward to more effective, inclusive science and conservation based on some of our experiences in the field. And then I'll also touch on a few systematic challenges that we might not be able to face just as an individual, but as a scientific community we need to think about. And also throughout this presentation, I'll include a few photos and quotes from some of our local collaborators just to show a little bit of how conversations with folks in the field have shaped the way that we think about these things. So as you all know, I'm sure, we're currently experiencing rapid biodiversity loss across the world. And a lot of this is driven by deforestation and other kinds of habitat loss. And alongside biodiversity loss, we also see a loss of the knowledge that accompanies these species that are disappearing. Deforestation is also driven by and drives livelihood shifts and changes the way that people interact with the environment, both in terms of their changing livelihoods and where they are in the landscape, whether they're in a city and not being as in touch with nature, not going into those traditional journeys into the forest, learning about different species from elders as they're gathering materials or hunting anymore. And so alongside these biodiversity and knowledge loss crises, we have a conservation capacity crisis. Traditional ecological knowledge is essential for conservation. We can't conserve what we don't know. In many biodiverse regions of the world, we have pretty limited scientific knowledge, and even where we do have scientific data, conservation is much more powerful and durable when we combine both scientific knowledge and traditional knowledge. So when we see a loss of traditional knowledge, we see a loss of local conservation capacity, and all durable conservation has to be locally rooted. Otherwise, it just won't endure. And so this is a significant challenge. However, I'd just like, through this presentation, to show some ways that we can think as scientists about preserving and rebuilding local capacity and preserving traditional ecological knowledge. Simultaneously, I just want to note, as a few others have before in this conference, that the history of scientific work has often been very extractive, and that's something we must keep in mind as we relate with our local collaborators, especially when we're from a developed world context and interacting with collaborators and communities in lower resource areas. So I've been conducting my fieldwork in Madagascar, which I'm sure you all are familiar with off the east coast of Africa. It's a high biodiversity hotspot. I'm sorry, I don't know why those auto-played, but anyways, Madagascar has been isolated from all other land masses for over 80 million years, which has led to really high rates of endemism in species. Over 80% of animal and plant species on the island are found nowhere else in the world. And the island's really diverse geography, rainfall gradients, topographical gradients has created a lot of diversity within the island, and centers of microendemism as well. And I work in the northeast part of the island, which is rainforest. So now the question facing all of us as scientists is, how do we aid alongside our research in preserving knowledge, building capacity, and striving towards more equitable science and conservation partnerships with our fieldwork? My collaborators and I have outlined 3 principles which are informed by our work in Madagascar, but we believe are broadly applicable to folks doing fieldwork across the world. First, investing in long-term training of young local scientists. Second, integrating traditional and science-based ways of knowing species. And third, enhancing direct links between ecological research, conservation practice, and local needs. So I'll just provide a few examples of how we're seeking to do this with our work. Of course, we're far from perfect, and this is just scratching the surface, but hopefully this will spark some ideas and discussion. So first, in terms of training young scientists, both researchers and citizen scientists, are the conservation leaders of tomorrow. And it's really important to be able to train young folks, both those who have the opportunity to get a university degree and those who don't. They're both fundamental to the future of science and conservation. So we've been trying to integrate students from multiple universities and local youth in immersive field and apprenticeships alongside our field work, where they learn both scientific methods and scientific inquiry, but we also partner them with our local elders and botanical experts so that they can get some of this immersive experience with species, learning the stories, learning the traditional ecological knowledge, that there aren't as many routes for them to have these days. And alongside that, students start to learn more about data management, leadership, team management, which is really great professionally. And this past year, we were also able to conduct a workshop on a tree identification and specimen collection, which was something requested by our local collaborators. We did this in conjunction with Missouri Botanical Garden, and everyone was really enthusiastic about it, and we hope to provide more investment in the future because this is really a long-term process. Also, to ensure science is applicable and even matters in the long run, we need to find ways to integrate ways of knowing and communicate with folks. During the course of my fieldwork, I realized that scientific information on species and local knowledge about them have not been properly linked throughout much of Madagascar, with a fundamental disconnect in just the way we're naming and referring to species. So my local collaborators and I decided to start creating a bilingual field guide with photos, which you can see sort of a template in the bottom center here of what this might begin to look like, and including in this guide not only identification characteristics like the shape of the, the shape of the canopy, the trunk, the sap, the fruits, what a seedling might look like, but also something about their role in forest regeneration. If we know how to cultivate them, how do we do that? And to incorporate some traditional use and stories as well. So finally, it's also crucial to enhance links between research and conservation, both from a top-down and bottom-up approach, so both reaching out to policymakers and decision makers on a broader scale, and also enhancing communication with local communities to inform research priorities and design, ideally striving for these principles of co-creation that folks have also mentioned already in the conference. And so here are just a few ways that we have been trying to integrate local folks in research. First, with work and training opportunities associated with fieldwork, and co-designing research processes as much as possible. You can see on the left here, Jean-Cri, he's also here teaching us how to better germinate seeds of Canarium, which is a keystone forest species in Madagascar. And we integrated some of what he taught us into our restoration experiments, which has been incredibly helpful. And he's been a great teacher for the youth involved in the teams as well. Also, kind of building off of this, we ended up doing a scientific experiment on Canarium germination, which you can see some more seedlings here. And then once we ended that experiment, there were a lot of local conservationists really interested in taking these trees and planting them on their lands. So we provided those to folks in the community, and now they're growing there as well. We also try to find other ways through conversations with folks and see what also is already going on in the region to support local conservation efforts. So Jackson, who's a guide at Merced National Park, where I've been doing field work, has been working with my collaborators at LCF for a while, and he's reforesting some of the land on his own property. So this secondary forest here is pretty much all trees that Jackson has planted. And he's asked for some support in trying to get seedlings, choose which species to plant, and also to monitor those and really share what he's doing in this very successful example of local conservation as well. And then finally, I'll just go through a few overall barriers or greater barriers to some of this work that we need to address as a scientific community. Firstly, there's never enough investment in capacity building. The financial structures aren't really there alongside a lot of research funding. Oftentimes initiatives are pretty ephemeral, and afterwards communities and participants feel forgotten because the grant was only for 5 years and now everyone's gone. And that doesn't do anything to build trust. So long-term investment is really essential in terms of capacity building. Also, there's just deeply ingrained structural challenges for the way that we think about doing research, the way bureaucracies are set up and whatnot. And this really gets in the way of forming truly equitable partnerships and building capacity. Sometimes doing things the right way is just incredibly difficult, and we as a scientific community need to try and create incentives to do things better and lower structural barriers to enable greater equity in our research. And finally, there's always going to be challenges in cross-cultural communication. A few folks earlier have mentioned the importance of language and being able to communicate with communities we interact with. But even if we can speak the same language, how I see equity, inclusion, or even corruption as an American might be different than how my collaborators based in Antananarivo, the capital city of Madagascar, would view those concepts, which might be different from the communities directly surrounding our research sites at Marajejy. So if we're seeking for equitable, empowering research and conservation, this requires ongoing dialogue, active listening, and a willingness to respond and change as needed, and flexibility in structures that allows us to do that. So I just want to leave you all with a few key takeaways. Firstly, that traditional ecological knowledge is essential. We can't conserve what we don't care about. We can't care about what we don't know. It's especially important that local communities know about the ecology around them because they're ultimately the biggest players in local conservation. And we as researchers have a unique opportunity and I believe responsibility to invest in local scientific and conservation capacity. And finally, we must reframe the way we think about investing in science and conservation to ensure that our research results are actually applicable to making conservation work. And we actually have durable frameworks for this. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone who's helped me in all of my research, both through local collaborations, international collaborations, financial support. I'm very grateful for everyone I've been able to work with, and thank you for listening today.
Thank you, Kat, for doing two things. You got the dictionary definition, both of them, correct in terms of your own work, and you were showed an excellent example of the idea of ethnographic sensibility. Even though you didn't use the term, it's quite clear that your project is doing that in a very significant way. So, thank you. Our next talk is by Paul Barber. He's a professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at UCLA. His research integrates genetics, genomics, and ecology to promote more marine conservation. His research is conducted within educational programs like the Diversity Project that creates inclusive pathways into science. He has won numerous awards for this work. You should look at his short bio. It's really impressive about just what people have recognized about this work and being extremely important and very interesting. The title of his work presentation today is The Promise and Perils of Field-Based Training Programs Focused on Expanding Access to Marine Science Careers. And so with that, Paul.
Thank you. So I want to point out first that I'm one person representing the work of a large team of people over the last 20 years that's contributed to this program. And at the risk of inviting a federal raid and getting arrested and drug off the stage, I'm going to say it, science lacks diversity. And there is far less participation of peoples from federally recognized underrepresented groups in the STEM workforce. Marine science is even worse than STEM broadly. And a lot of marine science is done without getting wet. So people do a lot of remote sensing work. They use autonomous underwater vehicles, things like this. But for disciplines of marine science that are field-based, training as an undergraduate student in field methods is essential. And if we go back and look at this lack of diversity in marine science, I think a lot of this can be tied back to the challenges in obtaining this field-based training. So these challenges come in a variety of forms. One is simply opportunity. So what we're looking at here is a map of the US where the number of universities that offer marine science degrees is color-coded. So dark blue, 4 or more, light blue, 3 or fewer, white is none. And what you'll even see is even on the states where it's colored light blue, a lot of those states only have a single university that offers a degree program in marine science. Another key obstacle is that, universities that have these field-based training programs, most of these international courses don't include students or scientists from local communities. So we're looking here at the 2022 French Polynesia Spring Field Course offered by UC Berkeley. They're all wearing their lovely palm frond hats, traditionally made by Tahitians, but there's not a single Tahitian in that picture. And this method of colonial/parachute science, people have said helicopter science, this is a particularly unpalatable way to learn for people who come from marginalized groups. Another important obstacle is cost. If you're doing scuba-based research, the equipment can be $2,500, the training, a couple thousand. Taking a field course can be, $4,000, $5,000, $6,000. And the important thing to realize with these costs is that there are a lot of programs that expect you to come in with this training before you can even start. And so it's a massive outlay of capital even to get going. And the third category of obstacle is that a lot of training programs, whether it's intentionally or unintentionally, do not project as being very inclusive. These are a couple of images from a Google search scientific diving program. And what you see is overall very white, very heteronormative, and actually a lot more male than the field of marine sciences in general. And so to address some of these challenges, 20 years ago, we started a program called the Diversity Project. The goal of this program was to increase accessibility to marine science careers through the study of marine biodiversity. And this was always developed to be a transformative field-based program. And we start the first week at UCLA with orientation and a basic scuba training done in the pool. And from there, we then go to French Polynesia for 2 more weeks of intensive dive training as part of a scientific diving program where students learn to use scuba as a research tool, but they also learn about the local marine ecosystems. And at the end of that training, we actually have students work in groups to develop their own research projects, their own ideas with mentorship from us. And then they spend the rest of the summer out in the field actually conducting the research that they devised. And then we come back to Los Angeles, where we expose them to local marine ecosystems, and we work with them on analyzing their data, putting presentations together, both for a symposium at UCLA as well as scientific conferences. The final 2 days, we have this research and networking symposium with the current students and alumni of our program. We also bring in parents. They participate in a Discover Scuba program where their kids teach them to scuba dive. But we also teach the parents what's involved in supporting your child as they aspire to go to graduate school. So some things that we do that's unique in this program to make it more inclusive is we create opportunity. by partnering with universities and recruiting students that are typically left behind. And looking at our cohort from this year, okay, we had a couple students from Berkeley and Duke, but most of our students are coming from places other than these large research-intensive universities. They're coming from Hampton, they're coming from University of Maryland, Baltimore County, Bemidji State, Santa Ana Community College. And key to getting really amazing students from these universities is we actually partner with faculty at a number of historically Black colleges and universities to identify and recommend students to our program. And that helps us recruit really amazing students that want to have careers in marine science. And these students often come from unusual programs. We use a holistic admissions process where we look at achievement through the lens of opportunity. We see Adriana on the right, Kira on the left, amazing young marine scientists. They study animal science at their universities because that's the closest thing that they can study to an organismal biology program at their schools. Students like Lex and Hunter, they were accepted to our program before they knew how to swim. And that doesn't happen in like any other program that I know of. One of the other ways that we create opportunity is we include students from local institutions. This is Ihirao, and he was the first Polynesian student that we brought into our program, and it's really been transformative, and it helps build capacity, as Kat said, in the local community, but it also really enriches the experience of the students that are coming from the US. The chalkboard there is a bunch of common words that we're using on a daily basis, and we have 6 different languages represented there as part of just linguistic exploration. So other things we do, minimize the financial obstacles by providing students all the equipment they need. We provide them with all the training they need. And then we cover all the program costs, all the travel costs, and we give them a stipend as well to cover the opportunity costs of not working during the summer. But we also minimize these financial obstacles and maximize the support for the students by funding parental participation. It's really key to get family members there to see how excited their kids are about this topic, to learn about the process of applying to graduate school, to learn that you get paid to go to graduate school, you don't pay to go to graduate school. And the other key thing that we do is we build an inclusive program based on an inclusive organizational structure. So we have a diverse team of senior leadership that includes academic scientists, people involved in science communication, dive professionals, but then we also have postdoctoral scholars, we have graduate students, and this entire team, mentors the cohort of current students, and the students can see the progression from being a student to a graduate student to a postdoc to a professional. But the other type of mentorship that we have in there is we have peer mentors that help students navigate the challenge of being in such a new environment and an intensive program. And lastly, we maximize student success by doing long-term mentoring. So once our students join our program, we tell them that we are here to support them throughout their entire career. And if you apply to graduate school this year, great. If it's 5 years from now, great. When you're ready, we're here for you. Let's talk, and we'll guide you through the project. And this better model of training people in the field results in better outcomes. So a very common program where students get field experience is the research experience for undergraduates. They did a study looking at success 8 years post-RU participation. 71% enrolled in graduate programs, 22% earned doctoral degrees. In our program, if you look at 7 years post-participation, 76% are in graduate programs, 38% earn doctoral degrees, and 8 years post-participation, next year, that'll be 54%. So a better model equals better outcomes. And the bottom line with this is that there are a lot of challenges with obtaining field-based training, and that limits the access of a lot of people to these careers. But if you approach these challenges proactively, intentionally, and inclusively, it unleashes the power of that field-based learning experience, and that is something that we can all celebrate. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul, for describing a very inspirational program that I think all of us would love to emulate in some fashion in our own fields. So our final presentation today is by Thierry Veyrie. I don't speak French, but I don't even know how close that was. He'll tell me. It was not so bad. Okay. He's the director of the language program for the Fort McDermitt Piaute-Shoshone tribe. He's a recent PhD graduate from the Indiana University and is also a research associate from the American Indian Studies Institute. His presentation today is entitled From Fieldwork to Holistic Community Engagement, Linguistic Anthropology in Native Communities in the 21st Century. I just want to say one more thing. I believe that Thierry is the only person here actually presenting about indigenous Native American communities in North America. I think I'm right about that. And that's really good, because I think we needed that representation. Even though we've all talked about other indigenous communities, this is one that is ours in one sense. And so I'm really happy that he's here and doing this for us today. So Thierry, please.
Here comes a cowboy ethnographer. So thank you, Mark, for this introduction, and thank you to Linda and Michelle and Patrick for welcoming us in this humbling city of Philadelphia. It's been kind of amazing for me to be here, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity from the APS to present today, as well as for funding my work in the past, because I'm a former Lewis and Clark scholar. So I went to Indiana University, and every summer I would travel to the field in my station wagon and sometimes sleep in the back of it because I didn't have any money. But Lewis and Clark, the Lewis and Clark Fund helped me when I needed it, and every time I would travel from Indiana to McDermitt in Nevada, I pretty much followed the path of Lewis and Clark too, and so it was kind of emotional in some ways, and not only for that, but because also I'm French, and of course some members of the Lewis and Clark expedition were French, and I always have this thing in my mind about this moment, and we've talked about Lewis and Clark expedition already, but just after what Scott mentioned yesterday, when they arrived in the the springs of the Missouri, then they entered the Great Basin or the Snake River area, and they met a band of mounted Shoshones that rode towards them, and they were fearful that that was the end of the expedition. And then, when the leader of these groups of Shoshones came close to them, he identified his sister, Sacagawea, who was born Shoshone and raised Shoshone and then stolen by the Hidatsa when she was a teenager. And she was she learned Hidatsa, and she was raised as one, and she was married off to, of course, Charbonneau, who was the French guide, and she was also, of course, more of a guide for them and an interpret than Charbonneau was. But this whole expedition is so interesting in so many ways, and even ethnographically, because this relationship to alterity was very important in this microcosm of the expedition, but also in the encounter with native peoples. And we're talking about inclusion today, but the main reason why it worked, the Lewis and Clark expedition was able to continue their path is because they were able to trade with the Shoshones and acquire horses in exchange for goods and firearms. So it's just, I just wanted to make this connection at this time to lead us to think about what reciprocity means, and that it's not something that's new. I mean, people have done it for years, but maybe we need to be more mindful of it, and also especially when we work with native communities, and especially in North America, because they have a long history of being disappointed by white people's practice of reciprocity. So I'm an anthropological linguist, and I work for Northern Paiute communities in the maintenance of their native language, especially in Northern Paiute. But in the history of anthropology, linguistic and linguistic anthropology has been focused on documentation, which has served scholarly purposes pretty well and has been important in the 20th century, but not so much for the use of native communities. So Franz Boas told us that, and in the model of Edward Sapir and others, that we had to produce grammars and dictionaries and texts, and when that is done, then we've saved the language, which might be true for scholars, but it serves no purposes for native communities. I shouldn't say no purposes, but limited. Grammars are undecipherable for community members. Dictionaries oftentimes are written in an orthography that they don't read and they don't use. And text, it's the same thing. It's an orthography that communities don't use. So we have to do the remainder of the work as anthropologists. We have to take those reference resources that are important and make them usable and palatable to native communities so they can serve their purpose in language revitalization. And I think that is one of the future of fieldwork, especially in linguistic anthropology. Just a little bit about my path as a Frenchman coming to America to do anthropology. I was studying anthropology in France and was a student in the tradition of Claude Lévi-Strauss and doing transformational analysis, studying myth and trying to figure out what it tells us about how natives think. And then I read this book, Custer Died for Your Sins. And well, I'll just read you one quote of Vine Laureate Jr., just to honor him, but, quote, "The implication of the anthropologist, if not for all America, should be clear for the Indian. Compilation of useless knowledge for knowledge's sake should be utterly rejected by the Indian people. We should not be the object of observation for those who do nothing to help us." And this is just one of the very sharp, pointy criticism of Vine Laureate in this book. There's the chapter it comes from is called Anthropologists and Other Friends. So it doesn't only apply to anthropologists. I think any of us could find some lessons in that critique. But this book was very influential for me because I started wondering, do I want to be an anthropologist? And I was studying at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales at the time, and I met Raymond Malley from Bloomington, who was a professor of anthropology specialist of the Lakotas. And he had a strong collaboration with some Lakota schools that were using Lakota language curriculum that was developed by his center. And so I followed him to Indiana University, and I'm glad I did, because I learned another practice of anthropology, which is, I mean, I don't want to suggest that all of French anthropology is totally disconnected from communities, but it certainly is more remote. France is a colonial country, of course, and the communities that French anthropologists work with are often very remote, so there's less of a connection. And I came to the US to get closer to the community that I worked with. And then, after I completed my dissertation, I I was hired as language and traditional culture manager for the Burns Piute tribe. So I had learned the language during my dissertation research that was highly focused on oral history, and so I recorded Northern Piute oral history accounts and translated them with elders. And when I got done, well, then I had some skills that could be useful to Native communities. So they hired me to start a language immersion school in Burns. And then later, I got a large grant from the Administration for Native Americans to develop language curriculum for Northern Piute and teach it in the McDermitt's Combined School, which this is a picture of my work. I should say that as part of this work, I worked with a team of teachers that were from the community and that oftentimes were elders. And they did not have any academic credentials, which the state of Nevada required 6 credits, academic credits, for someone to be able to teach in the school as a native language teacher. So I was the instructor of record and working with those elders that had taught me the language. And so those dynamics are very complicated. But we started with kindergarten and we created curriculum. And then every year, the next grade would be implemented because the kindergartners would go in for first grade and so on. And just in August, we were doing K through 3, and then the principal, well, last year, we were asked to start teaching high school Paiute, so we did that, and this August, the principal asked us to just do all the grades. And so McDermitt Combined School is, for Northern Paiute anyway, the only school that teaches Paiute every day to every group within a public school, which is pretty rare, and symbolically is powerful because a lot of those communities, like everywhere in North America, were subject to boarding school and the erasure of their native language within the school system. So that we're reversing this process here, I think here is important. So as I'm coming to my conclusion, I think there's a few things that I want to share about this idea of holistic community engagement, and that is there are questions we should be asking. We should wonder if our work produces materials that can be taken out of the community and used without their knowledge. We should wonder if our practice is known by the community and benefits to it. And very important is that idea of cultural exchange, that there is a reciprocity, and then oftentimes Native community also value grassroots participation and equality. And here I want to say something more on equality, and that is how it relates to inclusion, because in Native communities, well, Philip Descola had this idea of multi-species ontologies for the people who are in the animist system, where the idea of community is different, and that includes non-humans, that includes other species, that includes plants and so on, and that's really how Native people in North America a lot of times see themselves. So when we talk about equality, we really have to be mindful of that concept in terms of community that's beyond people, human people. So just to wrap up here, I think one thing that has been true in the 20th century is that we had, as has been said before, a rather extractive or exploitative practice of anthropology and other sciences that rely on field work, and then we need to reverse this one way, or at least make it a two-way road where communities benefit and learn and benefit from cultural exchange with scholars that come to do study and research within their communities. And then just on one point that Mark was talking about earlier about inclusion, I feel so humbled in some sense also that I was thinking about this concept of inclusion, and I don't feel like I'm including people. I think I'm included in their community, and maybe that's how we should frame it. Rather than including communities, we should really do our best to be included by communities. So, thank you.
Thank Thank you, Thierry. That was a good illustration of, ethnographic sensibility by an ethnographer, which is it's perfect ending for this session. So I'm not going to try to make any summary here. I will make one additional comment, though, to Thierry's paper is that Native American archaeology in the United States especially is becoming increasingly aware of the ethical responsibilities of conducting archaeology in a proper manner. And in fact, Native anthropologists and archaeologists have been taking the lead about how and which to do that. And so that's something, it's a very powerful and somewhat challenging for archaeologists of my generation to begin to see that taking place, because it's very different than the way in which I was brought up. But yet it's important to see that this is part of the future that we're dealing with in terms of archaeology, not only in North America, but other continents as well, where we've had, as you suggested earlier, extractive processes of doing field work, parachute, helicopters, you name it. This is something that we need to get away from and move from. The kind of work that Thierry is doing is being part of in that community. I'm very impressed by that. I wish I could have been part of some of my communities as well in a more robust way, but things are different and things change. So with that, I'm just simply going to open it up for the comments from the floor and have folks go. Okay.
Thank you. Scott Edwards from Harvard. Amazing talks, everyone. My question's directed first to Katherine, but it may apply to the other speakers as well. You're getting your PhD now. How do you manage the amazing outreach you're doing in addition to your research? Or maybe the outreach is part of your research? I'm just curious, and I think the question extends to the other two speakers. Amazing time and effort, and how do you balance that with your research?
Yeah, is this working? Okay. That's a great question. And I think in part, like, the outreach is completely integral to the research, because how I'm thinking about these systems is really informed by my conversations with folks who have lived in these areas for decades, and I don't have a lot of that context. So how can I form a good research question without really understanding a system? Before I did my PhD, I actually started working in Madagascar with the Peace Corps, which was how I learned the Malagasy language as well. And I think that in order to do really informed, applied, useful research in a time where we really need to be doing research that helps empower conservation and restoration before species disappear, there's no option but to integrate communities into your research and make sure that there's some sort of plan for continuity, that these results come back to things. And sometimes it is like a hard choice as well. Like, I spent 3 months in the field this year that I probably didn't need to for any of my PhD dissertation data. And I maybe shot myself in the foot applying to some like postdoctoral opportunities because of that. But I think that it was really, really important that at this point where I feel like I know enough and I've formed more relationships now that I can do something more, that prioritizing that is so important. And yeah, I hope that it leads to long-term investment, and we'll see where it goes. It's hard to tell too as a PhD student as well. It's like I've formed these deep relationships with folks in the community, and like I want to continue this research, but what do I do next? And I think that's something I'm struggling with, and I think that's something a lot of grad students are thinking about when they're trying to do this kind of work.
Yeah, just also to answer this question just quickly. In my case, I work for a tribe, so they don't care about what I publish. But I will say that a lot of the deliverables we create, to me, they are scholarly products, and they should be considered as such. But really, the community work is so important to as a person. It seems more fulfilling to do that work than when I taught college courses at Indiana University. Now, I do miss teaching adults and doing research. I mean, I still do it, but the academic research, and so there's that. But I think It's not. It's in this day and age we've had this problem with academic productivity, but it's really a recent problem. And scholars did not have such a problem back in the 19th century, 18th century, and people like Lewis and Clark and all those early scholars, they just published because that was important to share. And I kind of would rather do that, share the things that are important with the world rather than being on the grinding stone of productivity.
One last comment on that is there does need to be a shift in how academia in general values this stuff, because in order, like, it's essential to do this, to do the work. It makes the work possible, but if it's not valued, that's when people start taking shortcuts, because that's the quickest way to get to the productivity is you do it the wrong way. And ultimately that leads to negative consequences for, everyone.
I just want to comment on what Paul said. I was an academic dean for too long, and that's exactly one of the serious problems that I faced constantly was people would bring products to their tenure decisions or their promotions, and I would have committee members just going, no, this is not research, this is just stuff, this is outreach. I remember a very senior colleague of mine who was doing incredible work in Mexico for years and years and years, was going up for a significant promotion in the UC system, and I had colleagues that denigrated the fact that he was doing what they called outreach. They made it difficult for him to actually achieve what he wanted. So you can imagine then how that affects, younger scholars as well, trying to make a living in this very competitive, very difficult environment. Sorry, I didn't mean to take you away from your question.
No, thank you. Those talks are really excellent, and I appreciate your point a lot about us needing to push back on those structures, right? We can all do that, especially as we get more senior. Anyway, I'm Siobhan Cully from Rutgers University, and one thing I'm thinking a lot about right now is inclusion of disabled people in field work. And even in fields like marine sciences, where you have access to field sites through drones and remote sensing and things like that, whether there are more creative ways that we can think about how to involve these populations. So if you all have any experience with involving people with disabilities, and I ran a workshop not that long ago in disability anthropology, but across the field, so it wasn't just people who specialized in that. And one thing that really surprised us, in addition to having this hybrid component, were how many people wanted to be in person, actually, once they had the right accommodations in place. So all of this is to say that there might be some creative solutions there, and wondering how you guys are thinking through that. Thanks.
So I'll say, like, with our program, we've definitely had people that had people who are neurodivergent. We've had people with, like, chronic health issues, and part of preparing for dive training is getting a lot of this information that you actually wouldn't get otherwise. And so I think one of the things that happens in our program is that we're accepting people before we know any of this. We're not seeing people in person until we pick them up from the airport. And I think there's other things with dive training. There's this swim test that everyone has to do, but they're like aspects of it that are timed. And it's like getting rid of those timed aspects of things, because someone with like a chronic back injury, they're not going to be able to swim as fast as someone who doesn't have that, because like they just physically can't do it. But that doesn't mean that they're not safe in the water. And so really thinking about, it's like, what is a real safety concern versus ableism, I think is an important thing to do. I think there's our field struggles a lot more with other kinds of disability. I know, like, ships in particular are very unhospitable places to individuals with physical disabilities, and that's something that I think our field has a long way to go on.
I can pick up on that for a moment. I like the question because I never have worked with students in the field with disabilities, but I have worked with community members. And one of the most successful projects we ran was in Peru over a number of years, where we had to work with the local community. So we would hire anywhere between 20 and 30 of them every day on a rotating basis, so they would come and do the work for us. And it was very successful. But there was a point at which there were people who were not included in that rotation because they had disabilities. And so one of the things that we emphasized to the community members and their leaders was, we'll help them come down. Some people couldn't walk properly. They could only sit. And then we'd have to pick them up and put them, on the truck and take them back to their house. So that there were ways that we tried to accommodate them in the field, even though, it was a sporadic approach to it all. But it was more satisfying, and it built better inclusion, and it really built trust between us and the community, because that meant things, they realized we were there not just to take away everything, but to actually give something to almost every community member who wanted it.
Christopher Stapleton, Semiosis Real World Labs. I deal with stories and language and social cohesion. My question is, besides the source community and your community of research, how do you get your story of your body of research out to beyond you in time and space, that dissemination and outreach? And who do you work with? How do you work? What technology you use to translate that story to others to make it relevant and make people care?
Thank you for that question. I think that's a great question. I think part of in the history of fieldwork, of course, the story was never shared until it was. But today it's different, and there's all kinds of witnesses, and of course on social media people share what's happening immediately. In my practice, I guess I never left the field, but I've had people come to me, sometimes journalists, sometimes with partners like NGOs that were funders that would feature our work. And that's really the only way that the work that the program I've been director for, has been broadcasted, because the tribe themselves don't really care to broadcast what they're doing to the outside, but the funders do. So that's, in my case, the pretty much, other than academic talks, which I don't participate to very often, but that's through featuring from journalists or NGOs that my work has been seen.
One of the things that we've been doing for the last decade is we make videos of the program every summer. That minute-and-a-half clip gives you an idea of just sort of the type of imagery that we create. And we do it for a couple reasons. One is we want to give students something at the end of the summer that sort of like encapsulates their experience and is something that they can go back to and remember like how that made them feel. And wanting to do that again. And I think it's really important for our students, but it brings their families into the conversation as well. So during the summer, we're making short videos, 3 or 4 minutes that we will send out to the families to include them in the process so that they understand, the experience that their child is going through. And we can show these videos to funders as well, and they can get an idea. And one of the cool things that's happened recently is that sometime this fall, there'll be a feature-length documentary released where our program is one of 3 stories in the documentary. And one of the reasons why it ended up getting featured, in addition just to the work that we're doing, is that when they first contacted me to want to talk about this project, I could send them these videos and say, you know, it's like, if you're interested in the type of imagery that might be able to go along with the storytelling that you're doing, here's something you can look at. And so I think having, particularly in the age of social media and YouTube and all that, being able to have that kind of imagery that people can access and see, what people are doing and the impact that it's having, I think is really important.
I'll just add very briefly, I'm quite early in my career and I don't have as much experience yet with trying to share things, but as my results for one of the experiments I'm doing come together, I think the big takeaway is going to be we really need to change the way we think about forest restoration sometimes as well. And I'm going to try and do a bit more like targeted outreach too, to see what are people currently thinking, why are they thinking that in terms of this is the way we need to plant trees or something, and continue, I guess, developing a strategy for how to do outreach and make sure that the people who could actually make some change based on this research get that information.
Sorry, I'm not really a presenter, but I'm having fun pretending I am. Your question's really a good one because it's really about inclusion of a different kind of people altogether, the public. And, I will simply say, have any of you seen Ancient Apocalypse? Oh my God, nobody in this room? Well, I know one person would have, at least one person. Graham Hancock had a series on Netflix that was absolutely stunningly popular about how the world changed 11,000 years ago. This advanced civilization that once existed was wiped out, and that everything then has come from a variety of sources, including aliens and what have you. My point about that is he told a story that was remarkably effective. And it's incumbent on us to be able to tell stories that are counteracting to that. And so it's really incumbent on us as a form of our intellectual outreach to be able to challenge those things. And as I said earlier, things like that never got academic credit, and they still don't in many cases. That outreach just, nobody cares. I mean, it's like, okay, thanks for that. What's your next paper going to be? And so we need to be able to find ways in the academy to make outreach of that kind actually valuable, because if we don't tell these stories, people like Graham Hancock will. And if you really want to be entertained, just go look at the series, because it will really, I won't use bad words, but it'll really make you angry about the way in which the past is presented. And it's a remarkably racist approach to the way in which the world was created. So.
Hi, Lee Stobrin, University of Virginia. Thank you for these lovely models, really inspiring work. Question for Paul directly, and then for all of you. So you mentioned the NSF REU program as a funder, but you've got to have other funders. And I'm just wondering institutionally how you support this as an ongoing activity, because it's obviously, the scope is just really amazing. And then for all of you, I guess the more general question of kind of building, I don't know, like roots into institutions, right? So, schooling or field schools, stuff like that. So yeah, just how all of us, I often fantasize about, like, if I could just take over this program, the world would be so much better. So just inviting that comment.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So the first part of the answer is, I talked about NSF REU as like a comparison. We've actually never had funding from the NSF REU program. I've been chastised by the program officers in the NSF REU program once for referring to our program as an REU. It's like, no, you did not get funding from us. You cannot call yourself an REU. It's always been So up until this summer, this was the first summer that we did it without NSF support though, but it was always built into normal research grants. We've never gone after the REU funding. It's actually really restrictive, and it doesn't fit with our program model very well, which is one of the reasons why we haven't done it. So we've had NSF support, but we've also had support from the University of California. They have a UC HBCU initiative focused on trying to increase enrollment of alumni from HBCUs into UC PhD programs. And we've had funding from them for the last 10 years. Recently, about 3 years ago, I was contacted by a private foundation who learned about us through our alumni and some of those videos that we've created. And we had a conversation, and they're actually one of our primary funders right now. But yeah, it's a tremendously expensive program to run. And so, relying on a single source really isn't possible.
Yeah, the question of sustainability is really important. Now, in my case, I'm just here. It's only temporary in some sense, because the goal is for the community to take over their own program, So I like to see myself as such, but it is important that the program continues, and I've had the same experience. So when I was a doctoral student, I got a lot of small grants, including an NSF dissertation grant, which was small also. But when I graduated, then I was able to go for more substantive funding, including from the Administration for Native American, and that's really how the program started in McDermitt. And then through our work, we started having exposure to private foundations, especially in the state of Oregon. And that was also important for other reasons maybe I don't have them to cover. But there was really a historical trauma between the Nevada Piutes in the state of Oregon due to some wars and genocidal practices that happened back in the 19th century. So to me, it was also important as a way to mend relationship with part of their homeland to try and secure funding that could make the program sustainable for years to come. So yeah, it's a very important question. How do we continue to make those things happen? And at some point, it has to happen without us as a person too.
Well, thank you for your questions this afternoon, or this morning and afternoon, I guess, at this point. That's the last question we'll field right now. I want to thank all of the panelists for an outstanding set of papers, and thank you for your questions. And so with that, we're finished. So see you later.